the chat, you can just introduce yourself to the other participants to know who is in the room, but that's optional, only if you want. And you can, if you haven't joined an IGF session yet, you can check how the chat works and how the interaction goes.
All right. I'm just hearing from Agustina that she's not receiving the email with the link.
Mine went to spam. I'm trying to think what's the same of spam in real life. If you were in IGF in a building, it's like when you put the program inside a bag and then you search the bag and you cannot find it. You find the pen, the notebook, but you cannot find it until you click somewhere and then you get the program and you know the room. This is spam vintage, as it used to be. Yeah, just a few more minutes with just one participant having technical difficulties to find the room. Just 1 or 2 minutes more, we start.
What is this usually at internet and jurisdiction? Is it the academic 4 minutes? 4 minutes, okay. All right.
So, but for questions, people should use the Q&A function, no?
Yes, for questions for questions to the panelists. There's Agustina. Hello.
Hello.
All right, one more to go. Hi, good morning, Agustina. Thanks for joining us at this early time for you.
Oh my God, my face.
You're getting the full experience of a conference, jet lag.
This is not even funny. Among the things I imported from the US, I imported the Eastern Standard Time. So I realized the time of this session last night.
Yeah.
You're welcome. All right, just one more. Person to join us.
We already have a question in the Q&A.
Alex, are you here? Yes.
Hi.
Hi. Good.
Of course, I was like, oh, just one link, and then I realized the process. So
You're breaking up for me a little bit. Can everybody
I'm
else hear
hearing
okay?
the same.
Sort of a little garbled sound from you. Not sure why.
let me close some windows.
All right, but glad you're here. I think we can get started here. If everybody's, yes, seems like we have a quorum, lots of attendees already as well. So in the spirit of a productive session, let's get going. And it's for me to welcome everybody. Hello and good morning, afternoon, good evening, and thanks for joining us at workshop number 324, One Size Fits All, Global Norms as a Threat to Inclusion. I made this joke last time in the session. You're probably not in the wrong room, but if you are, welcome anyway, please stay. We're gonna have a great conversation here. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the group of co-organizers. My name is Jan Gerlach. I'm a lead public policy manager at the Wikimedia Foundation, which is the nonprofit based in San Francisco that hosts and supports Wikipedia. I'm today joined by Fabio Steibel from the ITS in Rio. He's a director at the Institute for Technology and Society. And also my colleague, Alison Davenport. She's a senior policy counsel at the Wikimedia Foundation and will help us today reporting and taking stock of what we're about to hear and explore here. We're also joined by a wonderful group of speakers who will be introduced shortly. I wanted to also thank everyone who's watching this session and also encourage you to help us make it a success by asking questions in the webinar feature on Zoom. But let me take a moment to frame today's conversation a little bit. In a nutshell, this session really explores the ways that in 2020 still, rules for the internet are shaped in some parts of the world and brought to others. The longer version of this is that the internet today seems boundless and inexhaustible as a resource for speech, knowledge, and activity that continues to expand every day. The wild internet was once heralded by its pioneers as a great equalizer, which would let everyone everywhere in the world have access to the same information and conversations, but also opportunity. However, as more nations see potential for harm on the internet and consolidated platforms struggle to cope with the volume of content created by users every day, every minute, we are seeing an increase in rules and regulations created to try to pin the internet into a shape that is recognizable and manageable. Unfortunately, what is recognizable does not mean the same thing everywhere in the world, and also not on every platform or for every community. This results in a race to export one singular vision for the internet, which could potentially threaten inclusion online. For example, while a certain platform may ban certain kinds of speech that discriminates based on sexual orientation in its terms of service, a nation where that platform operates may pass a law banning the quote unquote promotion of a homosexual lifestyle. Not only is there conflict between platforms' terms of service and national laws, there's also often conflict between the laws of multiple nations when it comes to what can and should be allowed on the internet. In practice, this can lead to a hierarchy of rules which must be followed online, with that hierarchy often being topped by large, wealthy countries, regions, or companies, which have the capacity and interest in setting the tone of regulation for the internet. Similarly, online communities from wealthy regions are often defining on-platform norms for other regions. Think of a subreddit or even a language version of Wikipedia that is dominated by users from the global north. The internet is a tool which has great power to bring individuals and groups from across the globe together, but there is definitely a risk that those meeting places are all beginning to look the same in a way, meaning that many users do not see their identities or values reflected in the modern online world. On the other hand, national or local standards set by governments or local communities often fail to reflect the interests of all in those locations as well, and can be used to suppress access to information or critical speech. In this session, we will examine the various sources of globally applied standards and norms on platforms and discuss both the benefits and real-world consequences of local and global standards on various online communities. From a policy perspective, to me, the most pressing questions that arise are the following. For public policy and community standards, but also local content, how can we ensure that communities around the world can develop their own set of norms instead of being governed by rules that have been shaped in developed countries only? And from a perspective of jurisdiction, but also access to knowledge, what is the role of extraterritorial jurisdiction over content for inclusion and access to knowledge in underserved regions? I'm very excited about this conversation today, and also the perspectives that we'll hear from our fabulous speakers. I want to say a few sentences about the format or the structure of the conversation today, which is hopefully interesting to you and will also help you engage if you'd like. We want to first, in the first part of the conversation, take stock, assess the state of play of exports of norms and rules and standards from one region to another. Panelists will be asked to help contribute and think what kind of norms are actually shaped in one place and then applied elsewhere. Alison and I will be taking notes during that part of the conversation and then respond to the panelists by sort of identifying patterns and really identifying the findings. Based on those findings, in a second part, we'll ask the panelists to assess the impacts that those norms have and what this means for inclusion online. And we want to ask you to also contribute in the webinar feature if you are able to do so, and we'll also take those questions into account as we report back. And with that, I'll hand over to our moderator, Fabro, to introduce our fabulous speakers and kick off our conversation. Thank you.
Hi, Jan. Thank you very much for the introduction. Hello, everyone. We have at this moment more than 30 participants, around 35 and growing. If you haven't been in a session like this before, you can make your questions in the question and answer button below, and there's the closed caption if you need. So I'll kick off with some of part of findings we have in the Latin American region in international jurisdiction and ILAC report we're doing that broadly says that 4 out of 5 stakeholders that think about regulation in local contexts do take highly relevant international contexts when creating their rules. This is that we have an international that is global, and global norms do matter for most of the stakeholders. At the same time, we have local contexts that are quite particular and they matter. So we do have this effect that this panel is all about. We have here 3 speakers. We have Frame Marovic, we have Alex Walden and Agustino Del Campo. We have civil society / academia / private sector. All of them have different heads. I'll ask them to introduce themselves because it's always better. But most of all, I would like to kick off with a discussion that's what are the norms we have? What are the global norms we have that interact with local? Is this about regulation? Is about law? Is this about terms of use of private sector? Is it about broad frameworks like GDPR? What are the norms that we see from your point of view? And then in the next block, next session, we start to think about why it matters. And please introduce yourself. Alex, do you want to start? Please introduce yourself to the audience and what kind of the norms we have that have this effect.
Sure, thanks. And can you hear me all right? I know my connection was not great. Okay, great. Well, good morning from Washington, D.C. My name is Alex Walden, and I lead the human rights work at Google. So I work very closely with colleagues across the company that are focused on sort of data governance. We're focused on access to information, on various topics. And my lens across all of that work, across all regions where we do business, is to provide a lens that's focused on human rights. And so that's really kind of how I enter the conversation from Google. What I'm doing is helping to provide a lens that's based in international standards on human rights. That means that we are also informed by regional standards as well, but fundamentally, because we're a global company, we try to start with kind of the most global of baselines to ensure that whatever we're doing in terms of developing standards for our products is something that that works everywhere. An important aspect to our approach to thinking about how we create standards across our products is obviously things like our terms of service. But then each of our products have specific rules for what is and is not allowable. Things like YouTube's community guidelines are an example of that. In creating those community guidelines, what we do there is try to create a foundation for the principle that we're applying globally. But of course, what we have to do is, like in reality, what's happening is that there are people in particular countries who are using our services. And so when we're looking at what is hate, what is harassment, what is all of these categories where we prohibit content, how do we ensure that we are taking into account the local context when we're applying those principles? And that's something that we are very reliant on external experts on. We certainly have regional experts internally, but it's something that is a constantly evolving conversation for us. And then the last piece is obviously the law intersects with that. We're a US-based company, and so that, of course, with a lot of US trained lawyers who do the work here, but of course we have lawyers everywhere, and that US legal framework really underpins, I think, a lot of the way the company thinks about norms and standards and legal obligations. And so the framework that we've developed to sort of deal with conflicts of laws issues as well is really about how do we ensure that we are respecting the law where we do business. And so we have also created a framework that allows us to do things like geo-blocking and removing content that is illegal in one country, while also ensuring that what's governed in one country isn't determining what's available in another country. So I'll stop there. I know that's kind of a teaser for a lot of other things, but that's just some of the core pieces that that are integrated into the way we think about this.
Agustina, do you want to take next? We already have issues such as hate speech, harassment, content removal in different countries. Do you want to take next? Please introduce yourself to the audience and what kind of norms are we talking about, norms/standards from your point of view?
Hi, everybody. First, thanks for the invitation. It's an interesting panel. My name is Agustina del Campo. I direct the Center for Studies on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information. And it's really early, so if I don't articulate, please forgive me. But I'm due to wake up in about an hour and a half, so it'll be around there. So the Center for Studies on Freedom of Expression is an academic center that is grounded in the law school at Universidad de Palermo. So what we do basically is provide legal analyses on different aspects of freedom of expression. And for most of the time that we've existed, we've focused on freedom of expression online and what's happening there. I guess there's 2 points that I'd like to make that I think can contribute to framing the conversation. I agree with what you said, Fabio, first with the results of the Internet and Jurisdiction and the ECLAC report, that Latin America at least has a lot of, it's not direct imports of norms or regulation from other countries, but it's a lot of permeability to what's happening elsewhere in the world. So, and I mainly see this as probably the conclusion of an ecosystem that has very little formal regulation worldwide, and very different countries with very different bandwidths to regulate this. So what I'm seeing, at least from a comparative perspective, is that few countries are taking the lead on regulation conversations, and a lot of countries are playing very reactively to what happens, particularly during the last 4 or 5 years maybe, which contributes to create maybe more permeability to foreign norms for different countries and for more direct exports of laws that may not make literal sense in other regions. And I'd like to refer to 2 examples on regulation at least. One is the right to be forgotten that has been exported worldwide. And in a lot of times, while the concept is interesting, the frameworks for the dynamics between privacy and freedom of expression are very different in different parts of the world. And that dynamic has not necessarily been taken into account in debating this kind of thing. The other one, also coming from Europe, and it's starting to be exported worldwide, is the European Directive on Copyright, and some of the rules and norms that that directive either directly proposes or indirectly implies or recommends. So that's one of the points that I wanted to make. There's a lot of, I think there's a lot of room for rule exporting, at least from a legislative point of view. Basically going back to the first point, because I think there's very different bandwidths between states to regulate these kinds of things. And that bandwidth, I think, is related to a number of different things: the size of their markets, the influence that they feel they may have on the regulation itself, issues of formal jurisdiction, where they have offices of different of the main internet actors or the big players within their countries. That also contributes to a sense of whether they can regulate these things or not. The others have to do with institutional aspects. A lot of countries are being very, very reactive to a lot of these issues that Alex was mentioning, and not necessarily proactive. What legislation do we want is not something that a lot of states can seriously think about, because they don't have the bandwidth to do that. Just a quick point that I'd like to make additionally, I think there's a main expert in this conversation that is not necessarily accounted for in every conversation. I think there's a false sense that tech alone can solve the social issues that arise online. And that's a big Northern idea. It's a very US idea, very framed by the First Amendment and Section 230. I think that's being exported in different ways, both formally through very different means, but also informally through somewhat social norms. I feel the civil society around the globe has sort of bought into this idea that tech issues are tech solutionable, sort of. I'll leave it at that, and then we can continue the conversation.
Thank you very much, Agustina. So Frain, we already have lots of interesting topics added to what Alex said. We have Right to be Forgotten, EU Copyright Directive. We have this tech alone cannot solve the problems from the US perspective that it might be on organizations such as civil society. I'm thinking here about myself as well. This is really interesting. And you have wonderful data because I quoted at the beginning the regional report, and you certainly have the global report and the evolution of it. So please welcome, please introduce yourself to the speakers, and what kind of norms / standards do you see happening and how they take place? And if you are participating and you were writing the chat, we are writing and following. It makes it easier for us to reply if you use the question and answers. But if you want to say something to the other participants, please use the chat. And then if there's something that is unanswered and so on, please use the question and answer and we'll ask. Frain, welcome.
Thank you, Fabio. And nice to see all of the colleagues here and friends on the panel, and welcome to all the attendees. I'm fortunate to be in Europe, so for me it's a normal time to be awake and alert. So all my colleagues who are having the conference experience of having jet lag, enjoy it while you can. We are all missing, I think, the conference coffee as we were discussing earlier. But as you mentioned, Pablo, we are just about to release a regional report on the Latin American and Caribbean region, looking at the internet governance. And thank you very much to the ITS Rio colleagues for excellent cooperation in preparing this report, which we launched at the Ministerial Conference of Information Society Ministers of Latin American and Caribbean on 24th of November. So just as you gave a little preview, but I would like to take a step back, because at this time last year, we launched a global status report looking at internet and jurisdiction issues and challenges across the globe, where we combined desk research with global data collection from over 150 stakeholders of companies, technical operators, and civil society and academia. And I just realized, I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce myself properly as well. I'm Frane Marojevic. I'm the director of the content program at the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. It's a policy network that brings together over 300 stakeholders to look, discuss, and find practical solutions to issues and problems of internet jurisdiction across the globe, how different rules, laws, and regulation impact on our global experience of the internet. And that's what we are focusing on. So when I look at the global report, which was produced last year, and some of the key findings are around 80% of the stakeholders consider that there is insufficient international coordination and coherence to address cross-border legal challenges of the internet. And vast majority, almost everybody who was surveyed, 95% agreed that that cross-border legal challenges will become increasingly acute over the next years. And essentially one of the conclusions is that we don't have the right institutions to address these challenges. And to take a step back to what was, I think, said by Jan at the beginning, but also by the other speakers as well. I think one of the challenges that we are looking at here in terms of the regulation is the framework and the structure that's being created is that we have the regulation of the internet or of the platforms of the internet by different governments and the authorities who are bringing in legislation. But at the same time, we are looking at the regulation by the companies. So essentially, in many cases, the terms of service, the so-called community standards, are regulating our experience of the internet. So this is the regulation of by the companies themselves. And then there is the regulation on the internet, where different forums, the different spheres of the communities are bringing their own rules in different rules and communities. And this is a very interesting example and development. The bit that I will focus on is much more on the legal and the divergence of standards across the internet, which are preventing, in a way, all of us having the same experience of the internet. It is clear that we are seeing a proliferation of abuses on the internet, and the governments and the authorities are taking action, some in good faith, but some are taking action in order to stifle freedom of expression and freedom of the media. And this absence of coordination, which I mentioned in terms of bringing together legislation, is creating a divergence of standards across the internet. So we have a possibility of legal interoperability problems on the internet, where one user will not know whether the content is legal. They may know whether it's legal in their own country, but they will not know if it's legal across the globe. So it may be taken down in different areas. It may be subject to legal restrictions on those areas. So they won't know which rules may be applied on the internet, which could be one of the serious problems. We are seeing assertions of jurisdictions within states, where some countries are creating legislation which goes beyond their own borders. So they're trying to regulate the global experience of the internet. So which problem of this could be hampering digital innovation and growth, that we don't all have the same experience of online that we have. And in a way, it favors the strongest, those who are setting the rules and creating those rules, are setting the standards. Augustina mentioned two very good examples of rules that have been exported from Europe to other parts of the world, the so-called right to be forgotten or right to be de-indexed, and the copyright. But an example that I think is very interesting and very important in this area is the German NetzDG legislation, the legislation that put the responsibility on the platforms for regulating what is illegal according to the German criminal code. And a think tank, Justitia, earlier last month, published a report where they uncovered 24 such pieces of copycat legislation across the globe, of copying of the NetzDG. And while the NetzDG did have certain problems in implementations in Germany, it was already subject to amendments, I think we can all agree that the law itself did not result in widespread censorship in Germany itself. But when you take such a piece of legislation and try to apply it in different legal frameworks, with different traditions, with different institutions that help implement the law and protect fundamental rights, I think problems can quite quickly appear. And while you cannot blame Germany or other countries for copying the legislation, it is clear that legislation which is copied can result in negative effects and negative structure. I think if you just look at the list of some of the countries which have copied this legislation, you can see how diverse their legal frameworks and structure is. I believe Kenya, Nigeria, India, Cambodia, Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines, Kyrgyzstan, Brazil, and even Turkey have made certain variations of this NetzDG. But what I don't believe is that they created the institutions that would support implementation of such law, institutions that would protect freedom of expression, the rule of law, checks and balances. What I found very interesting, for example, in the German NetzDG, is the link that that law created to a self-regulatory mechanism, which is very little known, and actually it took me quite a long time to figure out how this part is going to work. But in order to determine whether something is illegal, according to the German criminal code, the platforms can turn to a self-regulatory body that is specialized in protecting youth and children to give them binding advice. And this is an interesting element. So it's not always just the platform decided what is illegal, which is one of the fundamental, I would say, difficulties with this law. So I don't believe that any of the countries which are copying NetzDG copied all the element and the aspects of this particular law, which are important when it comes to this implementation. So I think this is the problem that we have in transferring legislation and legal standards across the globe, is that it requires different elements and different aspects in order to protect our fundamental rights to be also exported together with the legislation itself. So that's, I would say, the key things. And I think if I would try to answer these things, the problem and the challenges that we are posing, I think we'd need to find ways of strengthening cooperation and coordination of rule making on the internet if we want to preserve the internet as a global resource, that we all have the same experience of the internet, whether we are logging in from different parts of the globe. I think that's the key challenge for the next period of internet governance and internet development. And this is something that the organization that I'm working at, the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, is working on, trying to find practical solution. But I think it will be interesting to hear if there are any other suggestions in this area, how we can do this better, and how we can ensure that the internet remains a global resource and not splintered across different countries or different regions. And I think it's been referred to as a splinter net as a potential problem. So that's from me to kick off this discussion.
Thank you very much. This is really interesting. So there's a concern here about institutions, and then I think about from data protection agencies to telco agencies to courts and so on. I like the comment to make about regulation of the internet by the company or by the internet and on the internet to think about this product spectrum. Yesterday, I've read a good measurable report on Wikipedia. So they interviewed the 7 editors who are most responsible for climate change webpages. And that brought to my mind the draft bill of law in Brazil of the fake news bill. So when you think about how the 7 editors are working, they're pretty much working as a journalist. They have this fact check feeling that facts exist and that they should check it and reference and so on, which is related to the guidelines of Wikipedia and how you edit and so on. At the same time, they're working as a news company would do, like a television or a newspaper would do to portray information. And at the same time, there's a content moderation issue here that is similar to how platforms leave content or remove content. So a simple case can bring to different types of regulation. And in the draft bill of law in Brazil, we have all these conversations. Do social medias, should we regulate them as Google and Facebook and other big companies? Should we regulate them as television and journals or traditional media? Should we consider that we have a different format, like a not-for-profit self-moderation system? And all of that becomes a regulation, and we look for inspiration elsewhere on who has done that and how to regulate. So let me move to a second type of question, which is why it matters. And the panel is about inclusion. So I'll go around for another comments from each one of you and trying to think about the first question discussed it. What are the norms and how do we define them and how do we see them happening? And then we have all the examples, but why it matters? What are the opportunities here for expanding inclusion? And what are the threats or the challenges for restriction or limiting inclusion? I'll leave you to accept the order, whoever you want to join. Alex, you'll be the first on my mind because we started over there, but please feel free to ask questions to each other as much as you like.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. And I think, maybe I alluded to this a little bit in my initial comments, but really sort of the fundamental challenge, like why this is a challenge for platforms, the potential conflicts in country-based and regional norms and how they may conflict, is because we continue to try to create a global standard for how we are operating the platform. And so companies end up in a position where we are trying to comply with laws that have different requirements for us. And so we continue to be very focused on how can there be a global standard for what companies should be expected to do, so that we can best really reach that balance of ensuring that countries can create their own laws and make sure that the norms that are acceptable in a particular place are able to be managed, and that we can enforce that in technically, but also that Google is a company that has human rights values, and so that means that we do want to make sure that we are being rights respecting in the way that we are engaging with governments, engaging with our users and citizens of countries all around the world where there are different norms. And so it really is, it's a challenge, but at the same time, as you said, it's an opportunity, because really having a mode for people to communicate around the world is the benefit of exactly what we do. And so that is the thing that we're trying to preserve. And, we're part of all of these conversations about regulation everywhere around the world, and trying to figure out how those things can work for us, and define what the principles are that will lead us to, in lots of what Franne talked about. How do we figure out how it can work? And we're continuing to be part of those conversations, because we recognize that there's kind of room for us all to evolve our thinking in the way that this is all playing out.
Thank you, Alex. Agustina, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I'm gonna mention three. One of the problems with exporting legislation has to do, I believe, by what Franne was mentioning. The different institutional cultures that exist in different countries probably will formally make it look as if the rules may be the same across borders, but the implementation of those rules will be severely different. And probably, as Franne was mentioning, with important threats to diversity and inclusion, particularly in countries that don't have strong institutions to protect fundamental rights like data protection, privacy, freedom of expression. The second point I want to make is, I remember when David Kay was preparing the 2018 report on content moderation, regarding terms of service, and in discussing whether global norms or regional norms and what the differences were, one of the concerns that I had, and it's in our submission to David in 2018, was that this becomes a sort of race to the bottom, where in looking for common ground globally, you start going to instead of following the human rights principle of pro homine principle, always an interpretation in favor of the individual, you end up with a lot of common language on human rights that does not really reach the level of agreed regional human rights protections within the different places. I was particularly concerned for the way freedom of expression protections are drafted in the inter-American system versus the European system that has very different views. So if adopting global standards mean taking away from the protections that we regionally have negotiated and agreed upon, I find a huge potential to lead to a race to the bottom, sort of. The other one, the third point that I want to make is that diversity and inclusion is very often interpreted differently in different countries and in different cultures, and adopting a one-size-fits-all kind of policy may a lot of times perpetuate the exclusions that exist in certain places. I'll leave it at that. I'm sure Frane will address the legal implications and challenges for inclusion, and I don't want to overlap with his comments.
Frank, please follow.
Thank you, Agustina. I was just thinking, I mean, when you were talking to sort of build on that in terms of restrictions and versus one size fits all, it's also an interesting element in the development, how different issues are understood differently across the globe and a different interpretation. And if I come back to my favorite example of the NETS-DGs, that when the countries which copied that piece of legislation, many of them introduced sort of vague categories of content that they would like to be restricted in that context. So false information, blasphemy, religious insult came up, hate speech, which is notoriously difficult to define and implement, incitement to generate anarchy, or the issues of personal privacy rights. So the question becomes of how do you ensure that these things are understood in a similar way across the globe? And I think for platforms that becomes very difficult and challenging, who are being tasked to implement this legislation, and maybe that's something for Alex, is in terms of how would you understand this across different parts of the globe where the interpretation could be variedly different. And I think when we talk about the inclusion, there's another sort of another side to this coin, which is very important to think about, which is the internet needs to be also a safe space for people to feel that they can communicate on it. So inclusion for me is also, it's very much about freedom of expression, which is an area that I worked a lot on and area that I'm very personally keen on, but also there is an understanding that we do need certain rules of conduct and behavior in order to create a safe space. I mean, after all, in joining this webinar, we all clicked on, we agreed to something by the UN to be part of this IGF. I admit, first one, I did not read it. I just said accept, like most of the other terms of service, community standards, and all the other requests that I've ever applied for. And that's one of the challenges, as Fabio mentioned, when it comes to trying to find the right kind of rules and regulation on the internet, that we have the old model of media regulation. We have models of different aspects of regulation, such as privacy rights and so on. And it's, I think, blatantly clear that they don't actually all fit to the internet in terms of how the regulation has been applied in the traditional offline media. We do need new formats. But what we must ensure that when we are creating new pieces of legislation is that we don't throw out all the good work that's been done in order to ensure our protection of fundamental rights and values when we come to apply new rules and the new legislation of the internet, of the platforms. And I think the point I mentioned earlier is an interesting element of trying to develop this new framework for rules of the internet, I think needs to take into account different levels of responsibilities by the different actors online. When I talk about regulating off the internet, on the internet and by the internet, or by the platforms, off the platforms, on the platforms and by the platforms, I think it's not as simple as just creating different rules. I think we need to understand the different relationship and the different responsibilities between all the actors. Because what I see quite often now in terms of legal developments is that many countries are looking at the big tech platforms and saying, okay, you can do this, you know how to regulate this area, you know how to police your content online, so therefore you should just do it. And that takes away from the responsibilities that the governments and the authorities have in order to ensure that they also protect our fundamental rights and values online. And they have a responsibility in order to ensure good regulation online. So it's not just about handing over to one particular entity. It's a relationship between the users as well. users who have a responsibility. And I think you, Fabio and Jan, mentioned sort of subreddit groups and Wikipedia editors, and there is a responsibility by the users, by the groups, to implement certain rules. So it's a new kind of framework that we need to look at, which takes into account the clear understanding and the responsibilities between all the different actors to create good rules. I don't think we can find a one size fit all, but we need to find a one size that ensures that information online and the benefit of a global internet is available to all and to everybody.
Well, thank you very much. So we are on schedule, which is great. Sharp on time. We finished the first part of the session. We're going for the second part, which is good. Jan, Alison, do you want to summarize what you find interesting so far, and maybe give some challenges for the speakers?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the conversation so far. I found it super interesting, and I've taken a few notes, and we have taken a few notes. I'm going to try to distill sort of what we've heard into maybe roughly 3 patterns or so. So one is, I think, the obvious, that some countries are taking the lead in regulation, right? And others follow them. And sometimes they do that even if the regulations do not make sense for their legal context. And then they lack certain safeguards for free expression, fairness, etc. Also privacy, for instance. Examples for this are the right to be forgotten, but also the European Copyright Directive and NetzDG. This means that the strongest nations, quote unquote, are favored because they set legislation and standards early, others follow. And sometimes, however, that law doesn't actually lead to censorship in the, say, original country, but it may have bad effects in other places where the same context doesn't exist yet, or the culture isn't a good fit for that law. So the problem here really is that laws are sort of transferred arbitrarily in a way, and many aspects are left out. The second big pattern, I think, is that terms of services and community guidelines, top down, are built by companies with the aim for them to work everywhere. US companies often think their thinking is often underpinned by US legal framework, as Alex has also confirmed, and that doesn't mean that they're not trying to think in local contexts or even regional norms, but it means that they need help on the ground, and that they need to really listen to people who understand local frameworks and local contexts to develop those rules that may work everywhere. And now the third pillar that I think Frane has eloquently described as regulation on the internet or on the platform is sort of starting to stand out for me. Of course, also with my background working at the Wikimedia Foundation, these are the community rules that are developed by the users, by the people who use these platforms. And here it's not really clear to me yet how this will work with a sort of one-size-fits-all approach. But we are seeing sort of this notion that there is a shared responsibility, that users can share the responsibility for good rules, for enforcing them, and certainly developing them in the first place. And here it'll be important to not throw out good work. I think I also want to paraphrase Frane here, like good work that has been done around regulation of the media, promoting human rights there. And I think also community rules that are set by the users themselves will probably have to look to those standards as well. Now, I think that's sort of like where we are. And what has struck me in this conversation, and maybe I'm just slow to realize that and everybody else has already, is the following. I'm seeing sort of 2 emerging trends. Free speech and intermediate liability protections were originally exported by companies because they were rooted in US legal frameworks. They brought their work, their terms of service elsewhere around the world. On the other hand, restrictions that countries are now applying to the internet are basically imported by themselves from the EU, of course, using the NetzDG examples and the copyright directive example again. So these are sort of like two conflicting trends that I'm seeing here, and I'm not sure whether the speakers would agree with that or even the attendees. And then the final point I want to make is that while we have heard very interesting interventions here, one thing that we haven't discussed yet, and maybe we are also not the right forum for this, are technical standards, right? The technical protocols underpinning all of what we're discussing now haven't really been brought up yet. I'm not a technical expert, and I think it's probably best to like take a note for later, or maybe even for a later discussion with other people also, different forum. But I think that's interesting that we shouldn't forget that, right? That the internet and its protocols have been largely built in the global north. And while there is a multi-stakeholder approach at many of the standard setting organizations nowadays, it's still difficult for people from other regions to contribute in a meaningful way. Yeah, so I think that's where we are right now, and I'll hand it back to you, Fabro, to dive into the second part.
So, Jan, thank you very much. The reason why I dislike what you said is just because the frame you did is more interesting than my next question. So I'll give you all the speakers the opportunity to relate to what Jan said and how he understands this conversation so far. But I'll leave you out with another question we said that might be of interest, which is the standardization of standards. And then GDPR plays an interesting role here. GDPR has, for example, this adequacy decision test, which will say if your country is kind of like EU countries. And two interesting stories about that is when the adequacy decision was made by Japan, with Japan and with Uruguay. Uruguay is very much alike EU, so it's kind of like it took 2 years, but they did it. But when they look at Japan, Japan is a completely different setting. And then the concept of privacy doesn't have a proper word for that. So the regulation is not about that. It was really complex to find this standard in some context that was really different. In the end, it worked out, but it was a challenge. So how do you think about the standardization of standards? It might be GDPR, it might be NetzDG, it might be other things that we consider highly valuable, but how do you see these standards of standards as playing a role in this internet regulation? And if you want to address to what Jan said is of great interesting, particularly the technical standards, with something that we haven't touched base yet. Alex, do you want to start as well, or should we invert the order?
I'm also happy to jump in if Alex.
Sure, you go first.
I'm very much interested by this idea that you sort of posed in terms of standards. To immediately say I'm also not a technical person, so while I've been an early adopter of the internet in the 90s, I can't claim by any means that I know how it works, and I think there is a point in the chat on this particular issue, which I'll read in a second. But I think for me, interesting element, Fabio, that you pointed out is the GDPR example, and I see that example of standards in two ways. One is what we are discussing is a standard that's been exported, where other countries are looking at that standard saying, okay, we would like to do something like that because it's useful for us, and they copy it one way or another and adapt it, hopefully, to their legislation and their framework. And as we already discussed, that has problems in terms of are there right institutions and structures in place for proper implementations of such standards in other countries. So I think that's an interesting example, and I think for me on that sort of note, there was an interesting ruling by the European Court of Justice on the case of privacy. It was a decision against CNIL, the French privacy regulator, which was asking whether a certain decision that they wanted in terms of right to be de-indexed should be exported globally or only within the EU. And the European Court of Justice looked at this particular issue, and one of the conclusions they said it should only be applicable in Europe because the legislation in itself was designed for Europe, for the European continent, but there is certain harmony and standardization of what privacy means. So there is coherence in terms of legal framework and structure. What is privacy in the Europe? The European Union has decided within the 28 or soon to be 27 countries that that's how it should be, and therefore it should be applicable there and should not be applicable extra territorially or extra jurisdiction outside Europe. But what we are now seeing is through the copying of the legislation, it's being applied. The second principle, which I think is also interesting and important, and here I only have anecdotal evidence as a user, but it's become a standard for companies that want to operate in the EU. So I've come across a number of websites, and primarily I think news websites coming from the US, which when I try and access them, they actually give me a warning because of GDPR. Your content is not, the content is not accessible. We are not providing content in Europe. So they've actually decided that, you know, it's too complicated, it's too difficult for them to apply a particular standard. So therefore they are not going to enter into that particular market. So we are seeing also the fragmentation also from that perspective, so that companies cannot operate in the same on the same terms and on the same basis across the globe, and that becomes a challenge of how do we tackle this as well. So that's from me on that.
Agustina, do you want to do the reverse round?
Yeah, sure. So standardization of standards, I think this is not necessarily new, and this is not necessarily something that only impacts the internet. I feel there's always been a movement towards standardization of standards. And when we speak about human rights, there's already a standardization of standards. I think the main challenge with this standardization of standards is sort of what happens when you propose the direct application of the human rights framework to a lot of these issues, where really the more granular interpretation and implications of the same language means different things to different cultures, to different peoples, to different legal regimes. So I don't think it's necessarily a new issue. I think we should look at, I think there's very little exercise of looking at how we resolved a lot of these issues in the past as we look at the challenges that we have towards the future. Just want to go back to the point that I briefly mentioned before, which is my fear there is that this literally becomes a race to the bottom in every sense. So in standardizing the standard, we start relitigating a lot of the human rights standards that we fought for a long period of time, particularly in regions that had a harder time with some of these rights. Latin America has a heavy history of censorship, and it took a while for us to get to the conception and the definition that we have in Article 13 of the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights. And it's a different solution from the global framework and from the European framework. Not radically different, but slightly different, enough that it makes sense to look at it in a more granular way and make sure that in in adopting a global standard, we don't lose the individualities that we fought for.
Alex, do you want to go next?
Sure. And I think Augustina and Brane have really raised so many of the important points that I don't know that I have a ton more to add on this question, but I will flag that I am certainly not the technical person, but that there are many folks inside of Google and obviously inside of the other companies who are focused on the technical standards and how those relate to some of the legal standards and the regulatory frameworks that we are oftentimes looking at. So I'll make sure those folks loop back with you, Jan. But you know, I think, and maybe I'm a broken record because this is where companies are, but we are, I think one thing that somebody touched on earlier is about the ways in which, so companies are focused on how we can comply with the laws where we do business. Fundamentally, we have to figure out how we can respect those laws and comply with them so that we can do business in each country where we hope to. And so that means that where regulations, like sort of those who are first movers, as a few other folks have said, have an outsized impact on the way that companies are going to implement those standards everywhere else. And we are oftentimes trying to figure out if what's happening in one place is an outlier or if it's a trend, because it's technically difficult to shift everything every time a different country attempts to create a new standard, whether it's just for that nation or if it's something that appears like it's going to become a greater baseline. And so that's just to say that the companies are also trying to really follow what are the things that are outliers and what are the things that are trends, and how do we respond in a way that is meaningful to both what's happening locally and what's being expected of us everywhere we're doing business. And the other thing I'll add is about smaller companies, and that much of the regulation that's happening, certainly in content regulation, but also with respect to data governance, are regulations that are not simple for big companies, but certainly having more resources makes it more possible to comply, to be creative in how you comply. And I think, you know, that in terms of having a diversity of platforms in the market and making sure that users have choices in terms of you know, making sure that every platform doesn't have the same standards, that if you want a particular kind of conversation, you're able to find it somewhere. And we run into challenges when the regulation favors the platforms that have more resources and makes it difficult for others to continue to operate.
This is really interesting. So housekeeping here, we have 23 minutes left, so probably have another round of questions and then wrap and close up. If you have questions, if you're listening, if you have questions, use the chat, use the question and answer. I would just mention the previous question, and I'll address the final challenge, the final question for the round of participants, speakers to do. What about the standardization of governance of standards? One thing that IGF has brought to the debate, for example, is multi-stakeholderism. Now we understand that when I talk about internet governance, you cannot have one stakeholder only. We have to have several of them. When you think about how ICANN defines or practices multi-stakeholder is different from IGF, which is different from other players and other forums. When you think about what governance means, some will understand is a duty to consult. So you make the decisions, you ask and do whatever you want. Others will think it's a duty to collaborate, meaning that you might have a task that you have to share how the process is framed, not only consulting. When this comes to technical aspects, we see a strong play on that. Internet interoperability depends on technical standards to be governed, with multi-stakeholderism. ICANN might be an example of that. Internet infrastructure clearly depends on that. And then we see the private sector kind of innovating in this governance standardization when they start to create ethical committees, oversight boards, and other things. So what about the standards of internet governance? How do you think this plays a role, and how do you see this evolving in the debate? Remembering, so for example, mentioning Guy Berger, for example, mentions a UNESCO member states indicators. This is one of the things that has a huge debate on how we define indicators, how you measure them. So how do you see this governance of standards? And using Agustina's words, is this a race to the bottom, or is this a lift to the top? How do you see this process of governance and standards? Please, the floor is open. This will be your last questions. Please join the debate. Agustina, do you want to start this round?
Yeah, sure. So governance standards, that's interesting. I think multi-stakeholderism is maybe the common factor that I see as clearly established everywhere, as you mentioned, but not necessarily other factors. About multi-stakeholderism, what I see is that while the concept is interesting and it's been pushed heavily in global spaces, there's a lot to do to actually bring that kind of a structure to the local level, to the regional levels. The few instances for multi-stakeholderism that we see locally in different countries, and there's a number of different studies on this, they kind of show that it's not, the proposal doesn't cascade down. Decisions locally are not being taken based on a multi-stakeholderism approach. Not all the multi-stakeholders are willing to go to the local level with this kind of a model. And that I feel has a direct, or may have a direct impact on the issue of inclusion that this session tried to address and discuss. Multi-stakeholder governance of the internet being a global thing needs a global multi-stakeholder approach. But that global approach cannot be detached from the local and regional structures. And right now, I see serious challenges to that proposal. I think if we look at least at the last 10 years, there's very few places where you can point to for successful implementations of multi-stakeholder approaches. And that may have somewhat of a broader impact than we are giving it credit for. I think there should be a bit more research as to how much of the standardization, how much of the standardization of standards, how much of the exporting may be attributed to a lack of a multi-stakeholder approach locally and regionally, and a lack of a dialogue between the different actors involved.
Interesting. Alex, do you want to follow?
It's hard to follow, Agustina. I think everything you just said, Agustina, is so fascinating, and I couldn't agree more. As somebody who sits on the global team at the company, and obviously I engage with each of our regional and country-based teams. And so while I am participating in IGF, I do Freedom Online Coalition, I do GNI, I do less today, but I have done some of our work on GIF-CT and what that looks like and how that pulls from and doesn't pull from some of those models. And I don't see that necessarily, that sort of forcing function to have multi-stakeholder dialogue, which oftentimes slows down the process for kind of reaching the results that policymakers and regulators are interested in. I don't see it happening at the country level most often, and so it creates a tension that is where at the global level we are trying to all be in conversation together and drive forward norms that can be useful everywhere, while at the country level things are moving fast and it's not consistent how much cooperation and collaboration and multi-stakeholderism is happening as national level laws and regional norms are being created. So that's more just to say, I think the way that you expressed it is very accurate with and consistent with my experience. And I don't know what the resolution is to kind of help at the national level conversations slow down to ensure that we are engaging all of the stakeholders in a way that incorporates those perspectives to reach the best outcomes when regulation is happening.
Rain, do you want to join?
I can first of all start by agreeing with Alex and Augustina with what they said. Absolutely, I support that the points in terms of that we have important discussion on a global level about multi-stakeholder approaches, discussion debates, IGF and so on. Now, to what extent is this being translated when it comes to legislation being developed on a local level? I would question that. If I think about my previous work where I worked for an intergovernmental organization on the freedom of expression and where we did a lot of analysis of legislation that can impact and concern media. One of the key demands that I would say was always made is that any piece of legislation that impacts freedom of the media, freedom of expression, and our fundamental human rights needs to go through a thorough consultation process. This is quite a standard procedure when it comes to adopting these laws, but I don't see that to an extent being done when it comes to laws which are impacting our online freedom of expression to an extent. There is not the same multi-stakeholder engagement. There is not the same kind of engagement of all the people that are important. I mean, this conversation just shows we were just discussing, technical standards, and in our panel we don't have the technical people involved. So we need to bring the technical people in as well. We need to bring the academics. It is about getting everybody who has a stake. I mean, a stake in this process. A multi-stakeholder approach is essential. And I don't see any ways of going around it. I mean, your question, Fabio, that this is a race to the bottom or lift to the top. I'm afraid that at the moment that we are having more of a race to the bottom rather than the lift to the top, because I think the lift to the top are the internationally agreed standards that we have on human rights that have been developed. And I think we need to keep that top very firmly based and ensure that the race starts moving up rather than towards more restrictions and more limitation. I mean, we started off the conversation with the report we are just about to publish, where it's quite clear that we don't have the institutional mechanisms for this kind of coordination of regulation of the internet on a global level. That we don't have the institutions in order to ensure that there is no legal arms race in this particular field and this particular area. And I would sort of go back to the point that I made earlier, that it important to think about the distribution of responsibilities of the different actors in this space. And that's something that I think we need to see much more of as we develop standards in internet governance. That's something that the organization where I am is trying to do. We are trying to do this on a more practical level to try to find practical solutions, because we are not an intergovernmental institution that can set standards. So we are trying to find places where different actors, including the governments, including the technical companies, including the civil society, including the academia and the intergovernmental organization, can find common language and cooperation in order to ensure functioning and workability of the internet across the globe. And this is, I would say, to an extent lacking on an intergovernmental level, which I think there needs to be a more constructive approach in order how to preserve our fundamental rights and values online, as well as ensuring that the internet is a safe space as for all the users.
Jan, we have around 10 minutes left. You did a wonderful summarizing of the first part of the session. You want to jump again and do kind of the summary of the second part, and then we move for the closure?
Yeah, I hope I can do this justice. I think this section of the conversation was really deep, and I was actually having a hard time to sort of parse all the patterns here. But I think what we've heard is really that there is a first mover advantage, or maybe a follower disadvantage more actually, both for countries and companies. So if you're early on in regulation, if you're early on in as a company expanding to other regions, you really are setting sort of the standards. The challenge there is to really keep this open for everybody else. How can new actors move into this space? How can new stakeholders actually engage and help with sort of the development of standards that work for their environments, for their context, for their regions? And then to your question, Fabro, is there a standardization of standards, and how does that look? I think it was really interesting to hear that this is not just a phenomenon for the internet, but that this has been around for other fields. And to Agustina's point, human rights try to exactly do this, right? To standardize, to build in, to enshrine a set of rights for people into all levels of regulation and the law. However, this becomes challenging when there's market fragmentation, right? When you have sort of a lot of smaller countries doing similar things at the same time, moving quickly, and sometimes quicker than the safeguards. Frane mentioned this around, I think, the right to be forgotten, where courts at the European level are trying to build safeguards around this law, but the countries are copying it faster and are going ahead at the country level. What I found super interesting is this notion of standardization of processes, of fora, of internet governance, as you brought it up, Fabro, also. And here, I think we heard that the multi-stakeholder approach is very helpful, but it is very different at every relevant forum, right? There's what I can think of multi-stakeholderism is different from how IGF defines it, and others. And I think that was really interesting also to see in the report by the high-level panel on digital cooperation, who identified, I think, roughly 1,000 different processes around internet governance. And they share some approach to multi-stakeholderism, but certainly not the same one. So process really matters when you want to make sure that people can be included in governance as well. But I think Agustina made a super important point, is even if there is a stakeholder at a high level process, they are hardly willing to go local to ensure inclusion happens there as well. So this still sort of becomes a top-down, or remains a top-down approach. And that, to me, is sort of a pessimistic outlook, right? Is there only a race to the bottom? I hope not. And I would hope that there is still sort of room for exportation of, or exporting positive protections and inclusive policies. And I think what we heard towards the end of the conversation is that coordination really matters. And then the question becomes, of course, who can do this? And just thinking about IGF right now, maybe IGF Plus is where this will happen. Maybe not. I'm pretty sure there are various opinions on this. But this role for a secretariat that is maybe more empowered, that can help with the standardization of standards and the meaningful multi-stakeholder approach seems to be important to me. And I just want to take the liberty real quick to, since I work at the Wikimedia Foundation, to plug one process that Wikimedia as a movement has gone through over the last 3 years. And I'll just put the link to that in chat here real quick for you to check out later. This is the process towards a Wikimedia movement strategy until 2030. And this was still is actually an ongoing process, 3 years of consultations with regional groups, with national groups of Wikimedians, and basically open channels to listen to everybody who has an opinion and valid feedback and input for how Wikimedia should look in 2030. Now, I'm not saying this is a perfect process, it's I think a very burdensome process for people who want to give input, who want to be heard, and it's also very burdensome for the people who need to facilitate those conversations. There have been people literally, and I can say this here, I think, burned out by the process, who volunteer, who do this in their volunteer capacity, right? They're Wikimedians, they have a day job, and in the evenings they edit Wikipedia, they know how Wikipedia works, they know what the internet should look like for Wikipedia and what Wikipedia's role on the internet should be in 2030. But it's hard to get this across. These conversations are difficult to have, right? And to, I think, Agustina's point, really, to really make sure that people feel included in these processes, you have to go very, very local, but that's a lot of work. You have to really throw a lot of capacity and resources at this as a neutral secretariat, and make sure that this process is inclusive. And it can't just be sort of a side note. It's really a long-term thing that you have to dedicate yourself to. And I think we're really proud at Wikimedia how this has worked, but we know it's not been without flaws. And it comes at a heavy price tag. But I invite you all to check out the link that I dropped in there, or send me an email later. I can also put it into the description of the session later so everybody can see it there. Yeah, thank you. And with that, I think I'll throw it back to Fabro to wrap this session up. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the speakers. Thank you for the participants. I have 3 minutes and we will be cut out and expelled from the room. So someone mentioned data portability in the questions. I think this is a great topic to illustrate what we are talking here. It's something that is really technical. It's something that we don't know much about, and it's something that is certainly deals with lots of jurisdictions and the ownership of our data. It translates to content, it translates to internet infrastructure. And leaving one message that the standards, we do have a duty to think about 2 internets. At least this is how I see in Brazil. We have to talk about the highly connected that can be part of one movement, and the 30% is connected who doesn't have internet, and then we have an urgency to bring internet to them. And standardizations may play a role in the 2 extremes, and these 2 worlds that come together. It's a topic of great concern. 2 minutes left. I will stop talking here. Thank you very much for all the participants. Thank you for the speakers. Thank you for the organizations. Thank you for the moderation, captioners. Thank you for the questions and so on. And it's a wrap. Please say a few last words if you like, and we're done.
Thank you, everybody.
All, and, maybe just to point out, there's a funny cartoon on this point, which was posted by somebody in the chat. So if you want to end on a smiley note, that's a good way to end. But lovely to see you all. Bye.
Likewise. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for the volunteers who help us and support the technology here, making it work for everybody. Thank you. And thanks for everybody who stayed up late and got up early. Thank you.